W is still smarting from Trump's trouncing his baby brother, Jeb, in the primaries.
Poor Jeb. He's doing another commercial on me, this guy. He's a maniac. This poor guy, I feel sorry. He's like a lost soul. You know, this poor, pathetic, low-energy guy.
Am I talking or are you talking, Jeb?
I'm talking right now. I'm talking.
You can go back. You're not talking. You interrupted me,
September 30th,
Are you going to
you said
apologize, Jeb? No.
Little of your
Again,
own medicine there.
I know you're trying to build up your energy,
please.
Jeb, but it's not working.
Oh, my God, that was so funny. So it's to be expected. Come on, that was brutal. That the Bushes would return to their natural habitat after all these years, places where no one questions international trade deals or the massive flood of humanity into our country. But it's painfully obvious that the Bushes were never comfortable with conservatives of the Reagan, Buchanan, Gingrich, or certainly not the Trump variety. They are comfortable, however, well, cozying up to the Obamas or hanging out with the Clintons.
I don't know if that makes any sense, but
President Bush
they told me to use some big words.
used properly.
Yeah.
So President Bush,
this is the point where I reach in my back pocket to make sure my billfold's still there. I don't know any big words. I'm just a
That's sweet. Well, that's nice. This brings back such great memories. Well, look, let's get back to the proposition we put out at the beginning of the show. Why is George W. Bush suddenly so vocal? We're going to talk about successive presidents. Well, I think it might have something to do with the economy taking off. Of course, the current market correction notwithstanding. 70% of registered voters in a new Quinnipiac poll say the economy is excellent or good under Trump. That same poll found that Trump's approval ratings are up to 40%. And an Economist YouGov survey has them at 45%. And then you throw in the incredible State of the Union, the unraveling of this ridiculous Russian investigation. We're going to get into more of that with Dershowitz and Starr. And the elites like the Bushes probably feel that now they need to respond. The stuff Trump's doing is actually working. The president should wear the tired Bush critiques as a badge of honor. Trump is doing what previous administrations were unwilling or unable to do. And President Bush himself should know by now. Come on, there's no constituency for perpetual military intervention, open borders, and totally unpoliced international trade deals. Mr. President, George W. Bush, your brother ran on that platform, and the people chose Trump. And that's the angle. Meanwhile, let's shed some light on the Democrats' glaring hypocrisy in accusing Republicans of undermining the Mueller investigation that I just alluded to. Now, you'll recall Democrats did everything they could to undermine Ken Starr's Whitewater investigation into misdeeds by President Clinton. And you compare what Democrats are saying now with what they said back then.
There is a growing concern, I can tell you, in the Senate in the sense that Mr. Starr is now operating out of any sense of reasonable behavior.
We get a politically motivated prosecutor who is allied with the right-wing opponents of my husband, who has literally spent 4 years looking at every telephone...
$30 million.
And more than that now, but looking at every telephone call we've made, every check we've ever written.
This is a president who on many issues is basically beyond shame at this point. So any sense of fairness or thoroughness for the sake of the investigation, I think, is questionable from the White House.
He is trying to distract and to distract attention from the Russia investigation and to discredit whatever Mueller says in the end.
I love that. Let's go to the man who was in the eye of the storm back then. Former independent counsel Ken Starr joins us from Washington, and Harvard Law Professor Emeritus Alan Dershowitz is in Miami. Now, guys, before we get into the Russia probe, I need to get your thoughts on this uproar over the staff secretary, Rob Porter. He's now accused by a couple of ex-wives of abusive behavior, and this was an absolute firestorm in the White House briefing room today. Professor Dershowitz, your reaction to the pretty quick takedown of Rob Porter?
Well, I want to make a more general point. I think anybody who is accused by the Me Too people or anybody else and who denies it should have an opportunity to make their case, to present their argument. Used to be that it was a she said, he said dispute. Now it's a she said and you can't even respond dispute. Both sides have to be heard. A process has to be put in place, whether in the White House, in Congress, anywhere else, whether it's a Republican, like in this case, or a Democrat, like Al Franken. There has to be an opportunity for both sides to present evidence, and there has to be a fair process for determining who's telling the truth. Sometimes it's obvious. Sometimes it's clear. But even in the Bill Cosby case, where it seemed so obvious to everybody, the jury came back with a hung jury. So we need to have a process. We can't suspend due process just because there's a movement afoot that is making some very, very important points. But we need due process.
Judge Starr, now the move seems to be to take down General Kelly, because Kelly's worked side by side with him. And even as one of his ex-wives said, I don't want him to lose his position in the White House. He's incredibly smart. He's incredibly dedicated to his job. But I personally had they had a bad relationship, according to her. But now they're saying Kelly's got to go because Kelly actually stood up for his integrity, because, as Alan Dershowitz said, these were accusations and hadn't seen a photo or anything like that, I guess.
Right. General Kelly, I think, was waiting for the evidence. And when the evidence came in, from what we know, he responded. And he responded decisively, which you would expect of a good military man. And let me just add to what Alan said, and I agree with what he said. We need to be reminded in this country, as we were reminded by the Felix Frankfurter and many other justices and great jurists, that the history of liberty in the United States is largely the history of procedure. Throw away procedure, throw away due process, and you have a very different kind of state. You do not have a rule of law system. It is precious, and so rushes to judgment are to be avoided. So let's get the evidence in, evaluate, assess the evidence. I think from what we know, that's what General Kelly was doing.
Yeah, and let's move on from that to what's happening today. To what's happening today in the Russian investigation. Professor Dershowitz, we now know that the Clintons paid for that dossier. It looks now Sidney Blumenthal was involved, an old Clinton hand. I mean, Judge Starr knows about him very well. Was funneling information to Christopher Steele as well. Some of it looks like it ended up in that dossier, or a second dossier that ended up funneling in, perhaps in some way, shape, or form, to that FISA judge. And yet Democrats will say, well, that's not dispositive. The search warrant to follow Carter Page was not only based in part on that dossier. So you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Well, we don't know what the FISA court decided, how much weight they gave anything. We don't know how much weight was given by the FISA court to any particular aspect. What we do know is that people who file an application ex parte in front of a court have a special obligation to present all sides and to make sure that if they're relying on something and they know there are questions about its credibility because of its source, they have an obligation to present it fulsomely to the court. Now, there's a footnote, apparently, in the application that does say that it came from a partisan source. That's not good enough. You need to act as if the defense is presenting their side, because you have an obligation to present both sides of the issue. And again, as Ken said, it's all there were real problems with the process here. I'm waiting to see the Democratic memo. I want to hear both sides of the issue. But at the moment, I think there was a breakdown of process.
Judge Starr, as a former federal appellate court judge, when you think about this FISA judge, we don't know who it is. I guess there were a number of judges involved in reviewing these applications. If a material fact had been withheld in that application to spy on an American citizen, and a material fact is the opposition candidate paid for the dossier, among other things. Is there any recourse for the judge at this point? Is there sanctions that can be filed against certain Justice Department attorneys? I mean, we had Joe DeGenova on the show the other night, Judge, who said he thought there could be ethical issues for the FBI and maybe even criminal charges if indeed there was some type of conspiracy to keep this information.
Well, it's serious. So let's not rush to judgment. Let's be consistent and say we need to know how that FISA application for the renewal was in fact prepared. Who prepared it? What did they know? When did they know it? And so I do think that this is a very serious issue for the reasons that Alan stated. And there's another dimension of this. The FISA regime was designed to provide a judicial check on what might otherwise be untrammeled executive excess, potential abuses. And so there is a very special call it a fiduciary relationship that I think is very deep, probably as deep as it gets. There always should be honesty and transparency with the court. There's no excuse for anything short of that. But it's all the more sensitive when you're talking about the power of the executive branch to spy on American citizens.
To go back and read your emails ad infinitum. There's one more soundbite I want to play for you guys. Professor Dershowitz, this was Eric Holder, former Attorney General, speaking out today. Let's watch.
If one looks at the dismissal of James Comey and the reasons why the president told Lester Holt he did that, if you look at the president's attempts to try to get people who were the heads of the intelligence agencies to get involved in this matter, if you look at the president's actions on the airplane with regard to that statement, there are a variety of other things. I think you technically have a case of obstruction of justice.
Professor Dershowitz, your reaction to that very quickly.
Well, I think he's wrong. President George Bush I did practically the same thing when it came to Iran-Contra. He pardoned Caspar Weinberger and a handful of other witnesses who could have pointed the finger at him. Nobody suggested obstruction of justice. A president can't obstruct justice, in my view, if he simply exercises his constitutional authority. He has to do something like suborn perjury, destroy evidence, pay hush money the way Nixon did.
Yeah,
and that hasn't happened.
Eric Holder has an interesting way of looking at these facts, but I knew Dersh would get it right, as usual. The dynamic duo, you guys, fantastic. Thank you so much. And by the way, it's ironic, don't you think, how the Democrats keep peddling this false story of Trump's collusion with Russia? And meanwhile, the potential evidence of the Obama administration's actual collusion with Russia keeps growing. I'll give you the details when we come back. Stay there. An FBI informant is telling Congress that the Russian government paid millions of dollars to influence the Obama administration and then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton to approve the Uranium One deal. Informant Douglas Campbell is now saying that the money was to go from a U.S. lobbying firm that's, by the way, populated from with a bunch of former Clintonistas to the Clinton Foundation's global initiative. And the plot thickens from there. Here's Ed Henry to put this new revelation in perspective for us.
Lori, good to see you. Fox has confirmed that this FBI informant, as you mentioned, Douglas Campbell, spent 4 hours behind closed doors Tuesday answering questions from staffers on the Senate Judiciary Panel as well as the House Government Oversight and Intelligence Committees. And he said in private that Moscow paid millions to that U.S. lobbying firm to try and influence then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, even though she has insisted she was hands off in this deal. This was a major deal during the Obama years that allowed a Russian nuclear energy agency to gain a controlling stake in Uranium One, a Canadian-based company with mining interests in the western U.S. A sweetheart deal in the end that led some Russian officials to tell this informant that the fix was in. The Hill newspaper reporting that Campbell says APCO Worldwide was hired by the Russians to influence the Obama administration, Hillary Clinton in particular, and they spent millions doing it. Victoria Tonsing, a lawyer for the FBI informant, told Fox that the Russians laid the groundwork for this deal after former President Bill Clinton and Frank Justra, a wealthy Canadian philanthropist and investor in Uranium One, went to Kazakhstan in 2006. Justra, a major donor of the Clinton Foundation, says he later sold his stake before the deal went through and 18 months before Hillary Clinton became Secretary of State. Now, she had the final say on this matter, but it first required approval by 9 different government agencies. But the former president received a $500,000 speaking fee, and multi-million-dollar donations flowed into the Clinton Foundation from Justra, which critics have charged was payback. Hillary Clinton has insisted she had nothing to do with approving this and said this in an interview with WABC.
I had nothing to do with the decision. Now, that is a fact. I had nothing to do with it. It was delegated to somebody else in the State Department, and 9 people had to agree, and they all agreed from all the different agencies in our government. And then 2 Republican governors had to agree.
Now, Clinton's aides have said this was a GOP manufactured scandal, and Democrats on Capitol Hill say FBI officials have privately told them they've lost confidence in this informant. But remember, the Trump Justice Department has sent signals recently that Uranium One and other Clinton Foundation problems are getting new scrutiny, Laura.
Thanks so much for that report, Ed. Really helpful. And now let's get some insight into the seriousness of this informant's allegations. And the budget battle, this thing has been wild all day long. I mean, Rand Paul gave an unbelievable speech. We're going to hear about that. Joining us now from New York, I'm so happy he's on. He wrote a great column, by the way. I think it was today. Dan Henniger, Deputy Editorial Page Editor of the Wall Street Journal. Dan, it is so good to see you. Before we get to the budget fiasco on Capitol Hill, I have to ask you about this Uranium One story, because Hillary Clinton all along has said she had no personal involvement in okaying this deal. She was one of 9 different agencies that had to vote on this from the Committee on Foreign Investment, but she said it wasn't her personal deal.
Yeah, she's trying to put some distance between it and her, as are the Democrats, who are now, such as Elijah Cummings, the Democratic congressman, suggesting that the Republicans are raising the issue of Douglas Campbell to distract from the Russian investigation. Let's get something clear. Most of the Russian collusion story at this point is mainly conjecture. Meanwhile, the sale of Uranium One, as approved by CFIUS, on which she sat, is a fact. And the story that the facts that Ed Henry laid out about the relationship between the Clinton Foundation, thank Justra, and the owners of Uranium One is well known. And I might add one more thing, Laura. We know that in 2015, the FBI set up an investigation into the relationship between the Clinton Foundation and various pay-to-play accusations. The Justice Department more or less shut that down in 2016, but the Washington Post reported last month that that investigation, led by 4 FBI offices into the Clinton Foundation, has been revived. So possibly the FBI will get to the bottom of the Uranium One story.
Well, and Clinton, I think a Clinton spokesperson said that they weren't even aware of the FBI's investigation, that most of the CFIUS committee that approved this sale, again, 20% of U.S. uranium production bought by this Uranium One company, originally Canadian, bought by the Russians, Russian state-owned company named Rosatom, turned into Uranium One, buys this. And they said, oh, we didn't know there was a racketeering, corruption, influence peddling investigation going on. Now, to me, that seems like bizarre that they wouldn't know that the FBI is looking into this.
How could the State Department seriously argue that they didn't know that any of this was going on? I mean, even back then, the FBI had offices in New York, Washington, Los Angeles, and Little Rock, where the Clinton Foundation is headquartered, starting this investigation. It is just beyond belief that the Clinton Foundation at least was advised that the FBI was making this investigation, and surely that would have found its way to the Secretary of State.
All right, Dan, let's move to draining the swamp. What we thought was going to happen with the Republicans in charge of the House, the Senate, and the White House, we're going to instill some fiscal responsibility in this budget process. But here we are again, right up against the clock. Rand Paul gave a stem winder of a speech today on the Senate floor. It was unbelievable. Let's watch a piece of it.
Are you going to cheer for the Republicans and Democrats holding hands and having $1 trillion deficit, or are you going to say to yourself, I'm suspicious that the Republicans and Democrats are clasping hands and giving us $1 trillion deficit?
Dan, $1 trillion added to the deficit. $1 trillion we're going to have to borrow. Your reaction?
Well, I'm kind of a mixed feeling about what Senator Paul is doing here. I certainly agree with him. We don't want to drive the deficit towards $1 trillion. But this is really the 11th hour, literally, to be stepping in here and holding up this budget deal, which at its bottom is really about finally extending sufficient funding to the U.S. military across 2 years. I mean, when Defense Secretary Mattis came up there on Capitol Hill yesterday and said, look, guys, if we don't get this money, we're going to continue to have soldiers, pilots killed in training exercises. We simply do not have what we need. They have to get that done. And I do think there's a problem here. You know, the government shutdown, that was owned by the Democrats the last time it happened. And I think they're going to stand back and point to Senator Paul and say, hey, look, it's your guy who's threatening to shut down the government now, not us.
Right.
So he's taking the political heat off the Democrats.
But Dan, you know what he's doing? Because I talked to one of his people earlier tonight. They just want to vote on the amendment. They just want to vote on the amendment to stay within their, their budget limitations. And if he gets that vote, then they'll be able to go forward. They're just looking for a vote on an amendment. I don't know why they won't give him that vote.
Well, the government is supposed to shut down at midnight. If they could get that done before midnight, I think they'd be happy to do it for him. But really, the question is not so much the discretionary spending inside this budget. The real problem, as Senator Paul knows, is the entitlement spending, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And we're not going to be able to do anything about that unless you get more than 51 senators in the Senate as we have now.
All right, Dan Henninger, thanks so much. And we're coming to you tonight from the city that we all love, wonderful New Orleans. But it has a lot of problems, a lot of violent crime, and a mayor who seems more intent on tearing down statues than keeping the citizens here safe. We debate that and later Franklin Graham on the vocal faith of Donald Trump. Stay there. We're in New Orleans tonight, the city at the heart of the battle over preserving American history and Confederate monuments. New Orleans has the worst murder rate, and even worse than Chicago today, and more shootings per capita than Baltimore, if you can believe it. And Mayor Mitch Landrieu is on a crusade, not necessarily to stop crime, but to hide history.
These monuments celebrate a fictional sanitized Confederacy, ignoring the death, ignoring the enslavement, ignoring the terror that it actually stood for. And after the Civil War, these monuments were part of that terrorism, as much as burning a cross on someone's lawn. They were erected purposefully to send a strong message to all who walked in the shadows about who was still in charge in this city.
Now, New Orleans took down 4 Confederate statues last May after the city council declared them a public nuisance. There was no vote of the people. Landrieu called the effort a move toward healing. Let's discuss statues, the mayor's priorities, and what's next with Malcolm Suber, who is a coordinator with the group called Take 'Em Down NOLA, and Thomas Bruno. He's a board member of the Robert E. Lee Monumental Association. All right, Malcolm, let's start with you. So you must be pretty happy that you took down 4 statues. You got Jeff Davis down, Robert E. Lee is down, you got that Liberty Monument down, and Beauregard, General Beauregard, you got him down. So you got 4 statues down, markers down. What next for you?
Well, our name is Take 'Em Down NOLA, and we want to take them all down. There are more than 20 more statues that are dedicated to white supremacy in the city of New Orleans. We have hundreds of streets named and parks named for Confederate and white supremacists. And so we want to wipe the slate clean. And we have challenged the mayor from the very beginning, don't do a half job, let's do the whole job. If you really believe...
Okay, Malcolm, I want to jump in here for a second, because Jackson Square is, that is New Orleans, Jackson Square. Do you say that Jackson Square is not New Orleans?
Used to be the Place d'Or. No, it's not New Orleans.
Okay, so do you want Andrew Jackson to be eradicated from New Orleans in the New Orleans understanding? So Jackson's down. Okay, let's move on. Would you like Thomas Jefferson? Anything related to Thomas Jefferson? Thomas Jefferson has to go. George Washington has to go. Okay, who else? Who else is left? We got Is Madison okay? Is James Madison okay with you, or
no? He's not okay.
On the fence about him? He's not okay.
If he was a slave owner, he's not okay.
Okay, so we need to rename Washington D.C. Correct?
Yes, I would do that.
Okay, rename Washington D.C. Got it.
That's not for me to determine. That's for the people in
Washington. Okay, but that's what you want. No, we need to know. We need to know, Malcolm, where you're really coming from. We need to know where you're coming from, and we've just established it. Thank you very much. Let's move on to Thomas. Thomas, time for you to talk now. Hold on, my friend. We got it. White supremacy. We got it. Let's go to Thomas. Thomas, what's your sense on this?
Well, Laura, thank you for having me, first of all. And I would just like to say I love the fact that Malcolm wants to allow Washington, D.C. to vote on the name of the Capitol. Why didn't he allow us to have a vote in New Orleans on the removal of the monuments? The mayor, the city council decided for themselves on this issue.
Hold on, let him speak, please, Malcolm. Let him speak. Thomas, Malcolm, my friend, you must let the other guests speak. It is rude. Please let Thomas speak. Thank you. Go ahead.
Okay, so Malcolm says that these statues represent white supremacy. I'm not art. Folks are free to make their own interpretation of what they mean or don't mean. There are a variety of different ways of looking at these pieces. For him to say that these are this way and that anyone who disagrees with that is wrong, to me is absurd. These are pieces of art. They're created in a manner in which there are multiplicity of ways of looking at them. And when historians look at these pieces of art, they have a variety of different ways of interpreting them. When I've been around these pieces of art all of my life, and it never occurred to me for 1 second that they were symbols of white supremacy. In fact, Mitch Landrieu himself said, when Winton challenged him to take down those statues, Mitch said, "What are you talking about, Winton? I don't know what you mean, but these statues mean white supremacy." The reason that Mitch did not understand that is because a lot of folks in this city do not see the statues that way.
Okay, let's go back to Malcolm. Malcolm,
a lot of folks.
Malcolm, hold on. Malcolm, I had
whether or not these things are offensive to black people, and when these statues were put up, black people were not even
until the last
consulted.
I don't know what 2 or 3 years. And I've come to New Orleans on and off for the last 20 years. Until the last about 2 years, I hadn't heard anyone talk about the statues in Charlottesville, in New Orleans, in New York, and I hadn't heard anyone until mostly outside agitators came in and said, guess what? History has to be eradicated. We have to rename every federal building. We have to completely change history and context, and we have to get rid of it all.
Laura,
until the last couple of years, had never heard it.
This is the fundamental problem, because what's happening in our city is that one group of people is deciding for everyone else how we should think about a piece of art. This is, to me, the most frightening occurrence of this whole thing.
With black people, when these things were put up, and they put them up without any input whatsoever from the black community. And now that we have reached the majority, it is up to us to decide what.
Then Malcolm, you're right. Malcolm, I completely agree. Malcolm, you're not going to believe this, but I agree with you. It's up to the people to decide. And if the people decide they want to remove the monuments, that's the will of the people. Don't ram it through at night and remove the statues and put them in a place. We don't even know where those statues are. As far as I can tell, we don't even know where those statues are. Is that right, Thomas? We don't know what's
going to happen. One of the things that is so shocking about the whole process is that the city council and the mayor never had any plan in place for what would happen to the monuments.
No, they didn't care. Oh, they didn't care. But we're all against the white supremacy, but we're all for history as well. Malcolm and Thomas, we'll have you back, have you on radio. Both of you are great. Thank you so much. And President Trump, by the way, has made remarkable transformation into, believe it or not, a powerful voice for faith. Franklin Graham is up next to give us some perspective today. President Trump delivered a powerful speech at the National Prayer Breakfast in Washington this morning. He emphasized our country's dependence on God.
In the courage of our fellow citizens, we see the power of God's love at work in our souls and the power of God's will to answer all of our prayers. When Americans are able to live by their convictions, to speak openly of their faith, and to teach their children what is right, our families thrive, our communities flourish, and our nation can achieve anything at all.
To the surprise of many, the president, a man not known for his faith before the election, has become the most powerful religious voice in the public arena. To react, we're joined from North Carolina by evangelical leader Franklin Graham. It's so great to see you, Franklin. I thought the president today was, I thought it was mesmerizing. And I mean, Donald Trump is the guy who's holding the torch for God and Christianity and Judeo-Christian culture. It's stunning.
It is stunning, and I don't, in my lifetime, we've never had a president like this. And he's not afraid to speak out about his faith. But this was the 66th prayer breakfast. And it started, my father encouraged going back to President Eisenhower, and others worked on this at the very beginning. And every president since Eisenhower has come to this breakfast. And it is a bipartisan breakfast put on by Republicans and Democrats. And they work together. And these are men and women of faith who come together in a bipartisan way to put on this breakfast. And it shows you that Washington can function. And we need more Christians in Washington. We need more. Could you imagine if the majority of the House and Senate were God-fearing men and women, that they could argue their points, but at the end of the day, they would come together and work for the good of the all-American people. We need men and women in Washington who believe in God, who believe in His Son, Jesus Christ, who took our sins to the cross, who died for our sins, who God raised to life. We need more men and women like this. And last year, I went across this country to every state capital, asking people to pray for this country and encouraging Christians to run. And I didn't tell them what party to run for. They could be Democrats, they could be Republicans, but we need Christians at every level of government. And when Christians come together, this is what you see at the prayer breakfast. They come together and they work together. It was a great thing, Laura. I was glad to be there.
At one point, the president talked about how a year earlier he had asked for prayers for, I believe it was a little girl who was very, very ill. And he said he was, he was overwhelmed. I heard from others he had been overwhelmed by the response, the prayer that had come in for her. And he reported that, she was doing much better. That was just a small moment. But I personally, I felt the power of prayer at very difficult times. And the left doesn't understand this, Franklin, because they say, well, look, he's been married all these times, and look, he can have a foul mouth. He said these things in the past. How can this flawed man be this evangelical and Catholic, a leader in a way? I mean, how does that happen? How does God use people like that? And your response would be?
Well, Donald Trump is not a perfect person. I'm certainly, I'm not a perfect person, and I would hate for somebody to hold me up as being the greatest example of the Christian faith or the Christian life. I've got many failures in my life, and so does Donald Trump. But that doesn't stop me from believing in God and believing in His Son, Jesus Christ. And Donald Trump believes in God, and he believes in God's Son, Jesus Christ. And I appreciate the fact that he doesn't run away from his faith. And he's willing to stand up in front of the whole world and let the world know where he stands. And he appreciates people praying for him. Yeah. We need to pray. We're commanded to pray for all those that are in authority, Laura, all of them. When Donald Trump won the presidency, he became my president and your president, and we need, God orders us to pray for him.
Franklin Graham, it's so great to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. And by the way, Nancy Pelosi's pandering knows no bounds. Up next, we're going to look at how she used her grandson to advance her own divisive racial agenda. Don't go away.